All right. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming to session on from data creation to deletion, strengthening ESG practices, and I'm glad it's about ESG, and not about other topics. I'm Baz Kuti. I'm track producer, introducing Peggy, Tsai here to talking about this topic. A couple of housekeeping things. This is recorded and online. After the talk, there'll be a question and answer session, so please ask any questions you've got on the topic. But I'll hand over to Peggy now to take us through the topic.
Great, thank you so much, and hello everyone. It's great to be here at the end of day 2 of the CDOIQ Symposium. I'm just going to assume there's a huge online audience that I'm talking to, as well as everyone here today. So just a little bit about myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Chief Data Officer of Big ID. We are an AI machine learning discovery platform company that discovers data, enterprise data, for the purposes of privacy, security, and data governance. But been there about 3.5 years, but really my background is working in financial services companies, being in different roles around data, data management, data governance, things like data quality, stewardship, and really roles where I sat between the business and the technology side and really helping to accelerate the value of data. And certainly over the course of last 15, 20 years, different regulations, things like GDPR, privacy, and the rise of analytics and big data, it's really changed the role of data and data governance, and been really happy to see that type of change across different industries. So worked at Morgan Stanley before I joined Big ID, really helping to build out their data governance program, socializing the concepts with data stewards, standardizing business terms, building out definitions in a business glossary. So did a lot of those tactical but really necessary things that were needed to understand the data quality of the data that we were collecting and using. And prior to that, working in insurance and AIG, that was where we really built out a GDPR solution at that time, and then spent 9 glorious years at S&P Ratings. Really, that's where the fundamentals of how data can be used in a center of excellence realm is where I had my data experience. So a lot of just hands-on data management experience. Didn't go to school, but now I'm the adjunct faculty. I'm one of the executive coaches at the Carnegie Mellon Chief Data Officer Program, and I'd like to thank some of the alumni for being here. It's really a fantastic program, really teaching the fundamentals of data management. That's all the skills that's necessary, analytical skills, persuasion skills, right, to be a chief data officer today. So that's just a little bit about myself. So how did I come up with this topic? So ESG is actually not something I normally talk about in my day-to-day role as a chief data officer. I mainly either focus on our product offering or as a thought leader, really the best practices when it comes to implementing data governance. So probably about 9 months ago is when I created this abstract for submission for CDOIQ. And selfishly, I thought, okay, which track could give me the best chances of getting my abstract accepted? And I looked at the ESG track, and I really wanted to think about the concepts of how data is being created in organizations today. And a lot of the concepts that I saw amongst my customers that I advise on and consult on is around data deletion, data retention. So found a way to tie it to the ESG track. And this is actually a post I put on LinkedIn about 9 months ago. For me, it went viral. Viral just means that I had over 50,000 impressions, 27 reposts, and I think about 50 comments or so. And really the article is from the World Economic Forum, and if you find it on my LinkedIn, you can actually read the details. But what it was saying was really about the dark data and how it affects the digital carbon footprint today. And I really thought that was a sensational way of talking about how data is utilized, and that the actual utilization of data and data storage exceeds the airline industry. Again, I think the World Economic Forum was trying to be a little bit sensational, but certainly struck the heart and minds of a lot of the data people that I was talking to. So that's really the genesis of the conversation that I wanted to have. And then when I was building out this deck, and for those of you who know about the way that decks are presented here in this symposium, they have to be submitted at least 2 to 3 months ahead of the date. But so this is version of ChatGPT 3, and what I wanted to ask the ChatGPT was what they thought about ESG. What are the important components of it? And then I just built a Wordle around it. And I put data in the center, but it was not there in terms of the principles of ESG. It certainly has things like metrics and being measurable and indicators. And for me, those relate to data, numbers, and information that is needed to report, at least on ESG. So again, I just thought that was quite interesting. So just a raise of hands, who loves taking pictures with their cell phone? I think everybody agrees. Who has exceeded their cloud storage in terms of on their phone? Yeah, certainly me. So I recently came back from a 2-week family vacation in Tokyo, and my husband and I were constantly taking pictures. And the funny thing was that we would take pictures of the same thing. So we would order food from a restaurant. We're big foodies. Really delicious ramen or sushi, and he would take turns taking a picture, and I would take turns taking the same picture of the meal. And what ended up happening was we uploaded all our pictures into Google Cloud, Google Photos, and when I looked through the album, literally every day we took at least 200 pictures each, and we were uploading it, and a lot of it was actually duplicates of each other. So just thinking about our own behaviors when it comes to data and to digital photos, I think a lot of us have that concept of there's no cost involved with taking photos. I mean, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there were many of us printing out photos, or there were no concept of digital photos to actually to have. So the concept of unlimited storage when it comes to photos is something that we can control. And it's very interesting that when we look at our personal behaviors, certainly it gets to a much exponential level when you're talking about data that's created within organizations today, especially on an enterprise-wide scale. And this is what it leads to. I mean, I think visualizations are always great. And when I talk to my customers from an advisory perspective, it's looking at the number of data that they have on-prem, on their cloud, but be able to visualize that in terms of the levels of petabytes and beyond of the data that they're actually collecting and storing, and what is actually being used from an analytical perspective, and why are they continuing to create and store that amount of information. So this is where I really wanted to hone in a little bit and do some of my own research in terms of understanding the cost of the data storage. And I think personally, our personal behaviors when it comes to data, certainly, concept of unlimited data, the more the better, right? There's no cost to it. But when it comes to an enterprise, certainly we do have to think about the cost of it. So this statistic by IDC report is a little bit outdated, but the cost of storage certainly increasing 40 exabytes and growing annually by at least 45%. And the concept of, certainly cloud computing and that storage really came from, the hype of big data, right? The more data, the better. We need more data to do better analytics, and you don't delete any data because you never know what tiny piece of information will give you that key insight. So I remember in my days in early years of financial services companies, certainly that was the case. That was the mentality that we were looking for the needle in the haystack. And that's why it was always better to analyze more and more. But we all know that more is not always better. And I think what's starting to shift in the conversation certainly is with GDPR and the, especially in the US as well, the US privacy laws. I think the concept of really understanding the purpose of use and documenting that and really understanding why you're collecting the data, and is that purpose of use also good for the use for the purpose of fit for your analytical needs as well. So not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, but really knowing the purpose of that. So again, the goal that I talk about with my customers indirectly as well is how do we help you reduce your data hoarding, just because there is a concept of the reduction of cost involved in storage, but certainly there is a inherent cost in terms of the staffing that's required to maintain your cloud computing, your data storage. There's a cost of data management and understanding the quality of that data. And in terms of your disaster recovery programs, you really need to be aware that you're expanding that type. So really being able to think back, it's not just the cost of hardware, but other types of costs that are involved as well. So 2 years ago at the CDOIQ Symposium, we were all virtual, and I spoke with the then CDO of Freddie Mac, and who's now one of the chief data officers of Scotiabank. Her name's Jennifer Curtis. So we talked about the concept of data silos, and our talk was more around whether data governance teams should be federated or centralized, and what are the different types of best practices for that. But the concept, though, that we did talk about then applies today, because data silos exist today in organizations, regardless of how large or small data silos exist. But there is a purpose and a reason why organizations continue to have separate operational teams or separate technology teams. It just works more efficiently in their perspective. And a lot of the culture change conversations I have today is around encouraging organizations to look at things on a more enterprise-wide perspective. Instead of a line of business, are there shared data assets? Are there redundancies in the data? Are there redundancies in data processes? And certainly organizations, for different reasons, will continue to have multiple lines of business with multiple chief data officers, and that may work as well. But if there's no shared services that can cut across and really understand those type of data assets, it's really the start of the proliferation of dark data, shadow IT, and that's where a lot of risk can occur, especially with cybersecurity or data governance as well. So for those in the room, probably are very familiar already with the different stages of data lifecycle management. Just wanted to really emphasize the point here, and a lot of the conversations that with the other sessions that's been going on, we talk about the creation, the purchasing of new data, how organizations today are creating new type of data assets. And a second big piece certainly is the integration of that data, right? You want to be able to create new data sets, create new data products that's aligned to your business units. And then a lot of the conversations around data markets is that phase where you want it to be able to explore and discover, find, and provide self-service services to your internal customers. But then I feel like the conversation sort of stops there, right? Because certainly with management, it's the traditional data governance management activities. So, but the last piece of it, the most important part of the life cycle, as we all know, is the actual deletion of the data. And I'm not sure if there's any other topics, sessions that cover it, but really to ensure the full life cycle, you cannot just continue to create, to purchase new data, and to continue that integration. You also have to think about the proper life cycle, the proper retention that's needed for each type of data that you have in-house. One of my roles, my first time I was at Morgan Stanley, I reported into an organization, a team that focuses on records retention management. So depending on the terminology that's used in your organization, it could be records management, it could be retention management, but typically this role could fall under an IT role or a chief data officer. So that's also a very interesting observation that I have as well. Some companies that I talk to, the role of who owns the policies around retention, who owns the action around that retention policies is not the chief data officer. It's either perhaps someone in technology, or if they're very mature, they have an entirely separate organization that focuses on that as well. So what I'd like to talk to my customers about is really about where they are in their journey, right, in their data maturity journey, whether it's creating a catalog, building out this inventory, really understanding their data. But when it comes to deletion, it's actually a very hot topic. It's actually one of the most sought after conversations that customers want to have because they recognize privacy laws and the requirements of GDPR. They want to immediately jump to data deletion. But certainly there are processes, and when you're building out this data governance framework, there are things you need to start with. So the most basic one is having data policies. What are your policies around retention? What are your policies around keeping your data? What are your definitions of legal hold? So interestingly enough, one of my friends at one of the federal agency deputy chief data officers reached out to me and said, Peggy, can you actually send me a copy of what a data deletion policy looks like from the private sector? So it's very interesting. These are certainly conversations that they're not always best practices around data policies, but I think that one of the standards could be in terms of having this type of collaboration is certainly helping other companies and private and federal and public understand what type of information should go into the components that go into these types of policies. So certainly starting with policies, but certainly understanding on top of that data discovery, understanding the quality of that data, and then being able to remediate that based on the agreed upon thresholds, and ultimately making those decisions around data deletion. So what else goes into the mindset of companies that want to hoard data? And there are many examples out there, and two that I wanted to kind of point out. Certainly from the Securities Exchange Commission, talking very specifically around the brokerage and dealers must retain all client information for 6 years, and copies of all reports requested or required by regulators for 3 years. This type of language is a little bit vague because what type of reports and in terms of the form of the copies, there's a lot can be left to the interpretation. So companies hoard the data because they want to be, they rather be rather be risk averse. So it's better to keep than to delete the data. So when it comes to also on the legal industry, certainly there are even more vague guidelines when it comes to the type of information that lawyers should be keeping and safeguarding their client property. So these are just additional conflicting information that certainly forces companies to keep rather than maintain a proper data deletion policy in-house. So I'm going to go through 3 different industry use cases, and certainly these are generalizations of conversations that I have, discovery calls I have with different customers as well as prospects, so nothing specifically attributed to any one firm. But in terms of law firms, I actually think that they're a very interesting type of industry when it comes to data governance in general. There's, when you think of the maturity of different industries, certainly highly regulated industries like financial services, healthcare, probably more mature in terms of data governance, and then, it's often joked upon, certainly like healthcare and hospitals, a little bit later in terms of the maturity and the usage of new technologies. And then I would actually group law firms in the final bucket in terms of their investment in technologies. Just the nature of law firms in general is not around internally, at least with the technologies and maintaining that type of data governance. So for them, though, law firms, as we all can predict, they hoard data. Lawyers are, infamous for, taking notes, certainly in a written form. They have copies of the data. They're sharing and emailing their digital copies and versions of the same data. But what are the risks, certainly, in terms of the data that they're keeping, and certainly the legal exposure, the more data that they're keeping puts them at risk. The security risk is, common across the board in terms of all the different industries. And the cost, right? The actual cost of keeping more data within their house, within their on-prem applications. But these are the reasons, this is a bit of a blog that was written by a law firm on why they oversave data. So they call it fear of spoliation in terms of, they need to keep exact records of the data for different cases. So they have that, sort of fear. Uncertainty of data to delete. Again, it comes to not knowing exactly what the policies mean. And when you're talking to lawyers, certainly the concept of data governance and data management is something that's really outside their realm. So again, this is an area where education is needed in the field. Time consuming to delete. I mean, certainly this is pretty apparent, not just in law firm, legal industry, but certainly in financial services. It's sometimes manual to really understand the right metadata that correlates with the different policies, and just finding things like how long a file has been created. You look at the create date, you look at the last updated date. This is something I did a lot, when I looked at data. If you look at data that's, you look at the metadata that's involved around unstructured data and files. How do IT teams reasonably delete data without having more data, without really understanding what the data is, what the file is, and not really having all that information when it comes to things like the expiration date and the creation date. And really, I think a very common theme is, the path of least resistance. It's just better to keep it. Similar to myself on my cell phone, it's just better to keep all the copies of the multiple photos, because I never know if I do need it in the future. So that it's very common as well. So the retail industry, I think, is very interesting as well, and this is where I certainly talk to a lot of our retail customers, and retail in general, not a regulated industry, but certainly because they are so consumer focused, they have been leader in terms of data management, data governance. and certainly have a high priority in understanding their customer domain. But we've all seen in the news in terms of different consequences of data being hacked. Especially with retail companies, you're giving them all your personal information, all your financial information, all that is being saved by the retail stores that companies that you do business with. So I think privacy certainly has changed the game for retail companies to really think about their data governance, data management practices. I know a lot of my peers that formerly working in financial services companies, and in the last couple of years moving over to retail companies. And one of the first things they would say is that certainly there are new technologies that need to be implemented in the retail industry, but more importantly, there's so much data. Just transactional data that is being collected that they don't even know. The question for them that they're dealing with is they don't even know what data they have, right? And I think that's fundamentally, as a data governance practitioner, we all think about what data is my organization storing, and where is it, and what's the data quality of it, right? And again, a lot of the mergers that happen between stores and legacy applications, think that has all created to that breakdown in terms of having that really cohesive understanding of data. So again, certainly privacy regulations has been one of the ones that have been shifting and pushing for more of data governance practices to a higher maturity. Last but not least, the airline industry. Certainly, some of us that flew in on Sunday and Monday on the airlines know the effects and impacts of the information that the airline industry is certainly collecting about us. In terms of being able to understand the cost and again the compliance within the FAA in terms of the data that airlines are creating. And again, I think a lot of the reasons why we see, again, this type of attention towards data retention, data remediation, is also how they save the data. So in terms of also having very siloed legacy data, maybe perhaps disparate business applications that they're dealing with. So those are, again, some of the trends that certainly within the airline industry, in terms of understanding the customer information they're collecting, but they're also governing other information when it comes to the actual airplanes themselves. So it's really complex in terms of the information and how do you build that into a cohesive data governance program. There are multiple domains that certainly involved. So some of the best practices I think I've alluded to when it comes to building these types of programs. So actually, before I continue, I wanted to just kind of note a poll that I put on the Hoover app. And it was pretty interesting. So my poll question was, has your company implemented a data retention program yet? So maybe also, before I read out the poll results, maybe by show of hands, when I say the option, maybe if that applies to you, you can raise your hand. So has your company implemented a data retention program yet? Yes, fully mature. Great. So out of 87 responses, 28% said yes, fully mature, which is great. That's fantastic. The second option is yes, just starting out on data retention. Yeah, so that's actually representative of the poll as well. The majority of the respondents said yes, just starting. So, so that's great, and hopefully I'll provide some additional tips on getting started as well. There were a few that said, no, we don't need one, surprisingly. And also, even more surprising, the third most popular response was, no, we haven't even thought about data retention in my company. So interesting to know what type of company they are, that they haven't even thought about data retention. But certainly for those in a data organization, the data team, certainly data retention is a big part of it. So these are just, again, very high level, I think, data management principles that certainly can be used for the purpose of understanding how to avoid data hoarding. First is really understanding the ethical and legal obligations to retain data. So whether, depending on the different domains, client data, sales data, what type of employee data or customer data. So really being able to understand your different buckets of business domains, and then working obviously with the legal compliance and risk team to really understand what those retention schedules look like. And those are pretty standard as well. We work with a company called Filer Keepers. They are actually a legal company, and what they've done is they've created schedules, retention schedules of all different types of data types, as well as industry. So they're pretty standard and pretty useful in terms of guidelines, and it's actually what we offer to a lot of our customers who actually don't know where to start. If their internal legal teams aren't creating these type of policies, there's certainly standards that they can utilize in terms of looking at other companies in their industry, or really understanding different file types, what the standard hold retention schedule looks like. So based on that, being able to delete the data you don't have to keep, and keeping to that, and also what's not needed for your overall business processes. So being able to make that determination. The third point here is removing duplicates, removing it securely, and that's actually one of the top three challenges that I see as well with a lot of my customers, is that they know they have duplicate data in all their storage, like their S3 buckets or AWS, but they don't know exactly how many are duplicates, and it's only duplications within, for example, that file share across the board. They don't know what those duplicates look like, what the size of that duplication looks like. So that's really, again, from a risk management perspective, why are you keeping so many copies of the data? A lot of the concepts that I used to work with in my prior role was really looking at, deleting those duplicates, understanding what is your single source or authoritative source, and just keeping it like that. So that's really key, and we see that being an issue, a very common issue. And number 4 is having this written data retention policy and destruction policy, and actually implementing it. It's easier said than done, I think, in many organizations. Again, a lot of the different dynamics between the legal team, the policy team that created the policy, the data teams that are looking at it, and finally having to work with the technology team that's actually involved in the actual deletion. So this type of cross-functional initiative needs to really work with multiple teams to be successful. So shifting a little bit more on the ESG side of the presentation, really thinking about the cost of all this data. And these are some statistics that I thought were quite interesting. Again, this is, I found this statistic, which was interesting, but it was a little bit dated in 2019. So imagine what looks like now. So digital technologies emit 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and energy consumption is increasing by at least 9% a year. What's even more fascinating for me was, thinking about the cost of a single data center. And for many of you in the audience and listening, certainly your organization has multiple data centers across the globe, but one single data center, can consume the equivalent electricity of 50,000 homes. And the carbon emission, the carbon footprint of these data centers is about 0.2%. But if you include the carbon footprint of things like your laptop, your cell phones, which you all have multiples of, that carbon footprint increases to 4%. So these are relatively small numbers, right? But it doesn't make an impact. And these are things that we are personally contributing to, but also our corporations are contributing to. So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, ESG is not a topic that I normally talk about, but what I find, again, is interesting is that relationship, right, between data management, the whole life cycle of data, and certainly how it can apply to a lot of the principles that organizations are looking at in terms of ESG reporting. So again, this was pretty fascinating for me to really drill down into the different components of the environmental, social, and governance. And certainly organizations are going to be held to higher standard and level of reporting starting next year. But in terms of what organizations can do, not just report on their usage of natural resources or climate risks and things like that. I think those are pretty standard. But in terms of direct impact on the greenhouse gas emissions, I thought that was something, at least if you can control it, there's something you should be able to do. And that's really where data, what we do day to day, managing data, governing data, where we can really make an impact. Certainly, there are a lot of other ESG talks that certainly talk about finding the data, improving the standardization of reporting data for governance reporting, and certainly important from accountability perspective, reporting and metrics. That's where certainly can't argue that you need more data, but the actual governance and lifecycle management of data certainly can help, interestingly, reducing the environmental footprint. And I don't think anyone here can disagree. Certainly, it's something that is quite important. So just going back to the image of the different silos in an organization, again, really thinking about understanding from an enterprise perspective, and this is where I believe that if organizations have a better view holistically of their data, they can work towards, in terms of understanding their duplications of the data, they can work towards understanding their different data types, and then be able to understand how they can meet the different aspects of their data retention policies, right? Can't implement a data retention policy if you actually don't know what and where your data is. So it's kind of, let's start at the bottom level, right? In terms of a lot of the concepts that we talked about this week certainly has been around building that data trust, building that data foundation, but how do you really do it, right? So this is a very simplistic, anyone that's a data architect will agree. This is a very simplistic view of how organizations, look at their data sources and ultimately at the very top create that self-service reporting and dashboarding view of taking action on their data. But what happens in between, I think, are very reusable capabilities that not only a chief data office team does, but interestingly, in my role at Big ID, just learning the fact that security teams and privacy teams also do their own version of discovery, of classification, of classifying and tagging their data. They do their own different versions of data lineage mappings. Privacy teams actually call it ROPA, records of process activities. Security teams also need to understand the lineage and the history of how data moves across an organization. So again, really thinking about not just from a data governance perspective, but looking at other C-suite executives and how they are also creating a single source of truth across the enterprise. So I believe it all starts with data discovery. And for the longest time, organizations in data governance teams have been taking a very top-down approach to really understanding what their data is and where their data is. And what I mean by top-down, it's been mainly in terms of the way they understand data is through a Wikipedia type approach of really documenting their data assets by either talking to different data steward teams or talking to technology teams. But what if we could take a more automated approach, a bottoms-up approach, leverage automation, leverage technologies that are infused with machine learning to really help with the automation, automated discovery, finding, classification. These are, again, repetitive activities that happen across not just data teams, security teams, and privacy teams. How do we standardize those activities across the board in organizations? And that's really what I think is going to be key for organizations to be successful today. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper in terms of the 3 steps and these types of foundational capabilities and building that foundational trust. And step 1, step 2, step 3, I think there was a comment earlier, another session about how they hate pyramids. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have a pyramid slide. But step 1 is knowing your data. So again, I think it's pretty obvious amongst many of us who do data governance day to day. How do you build that inventory? How do you keep that inventory fresh? How do you have this catalog that has searchable business terms and concepts for your business teams to utilize? So starting with knowing your data. And I believe it starts because of this bottoms-up approach. I think that leverages automation, connecting not just to your structured data sources, your relational data sources. I think most organizations have a very clear handle on their structured data. What's the biggest risk for organizations today is unstructured. And I've seen organizations that have two separate systems for structured and another one for unstructured. But why keep it separate? Again, not having this holistic understanding approach. You want to be able to look at all your data, structured, semi-structured, real-time data, and be able to connect and understand it, and be able to allow your technology teams and business teams to discover. Discover means either searching for it, putting in a marketplace, putting in a catalog that really allows for your data teams to do the analysis, or for your analytics teams to really explore. And also the concept of classifying or tagging your data. For the longest time when I worked in financial services companies, we manually classified and tagged data. What does classify mean? So classify means you're looking at a data element. It could be a string of numbers. That string of number is your customer account number. Where do you actually store your client account numbers? I think the only people that know is maybe a few technology folks, your data stewards, hopefully. But if the account number pops up in a document, in an email, in a new view, a new table, you want to know that it exists. You don't want to be manually finding this information. You want some sort of automation that can tag it automatically as soon as it's created, as soon as it's part of your connector. So being able to classify this information and also put it in the right risk level. Is it confidential information? Is it highly sensitive? And that allows for a lot of the access controls and rules to be based on, the usage rules to be based on. So this, I feel, should be standard across all organizations. This is where automation can streamline and expedite a lot of this. None of this should be manual today. I'd love to have said that to myself 5 years ago. Not really possible. But the second step really is thinking about, this is a data. It's all the data, document data as well. Putting that into right context. Again, I'm focusing a little bit more here on the personas that I work with, contextualize that information, certainly from a privacy or security. They look at the data differently. A risk team will look at data differently than a finance team. So being able to personalize and put the right context of that data, and putting also almost thinking about like the right lens of the data based on your role in the organization is really key here as well. And how do we do that, right? In terms of being able to create, again, one single catalog that entire organization can look at to review, to understand the proper data assets, to have one single place for all your data products to be put into. And being able to service the different requirements that comes from security when it comes to privacy and understanding different privacy regulations your industry and your local region might be responsible for. And then also the standard data governance rules and responsibilities that come into this. This type of context could be additional metadata, could be additional attributes that just help label things. And when I was building out business glossaries, we certainly created like different synonyms because depending on different teams, they would call things a little bit differently. But essentially, at the end of the day, the enterprise data management team would link them all together, hopefully, and allow different terminologies to exist in a business glossary, but at the end of the day, realize that essentially the same thing. So putting that context into place is really key. And then last but not least, a lot of the customers I talked to have told me, Peggy, this is great. We've built out, we've understand our data. We built out this inventory. It's up to date. It's accurate. We've bucketed things into different personas and different use cases. But what I really want to do is take action, right? It's very easy to have this complete, accurate inventory, but at the end of the day, we all know that actions need to be taken. Things like remediation, things like being able to delete your data. You want to analyze, you want to do reporting on your data. This is where, even though it's very top of the pyramid, cannot happen unless you have the first two steps done. But it's actually the holy grail when it comes to being able to fully take advantage of the data. And these, again, are the common action steps that I see. There's certainly many more that when we talk to customers, they want to be able to delete all data that have parameters of, for example, like resumes that come from job applicants that have been denied a job after more than 3 years, and in this particular country, it should be deleted. They want to take bulk actions based on specific requirements, and we want to allow that, right? You never want an HR team and a legal team looking at every single metadata to determine the action. You want to be able to group these similar capabilities. We actually call it clustering. Clustering these similar files, these similar data points that fulfill the parameters of your retention policy and be able to take bulk action, right? So that is key. And then also being able to retain that data. Certainly there are certain exceptions, especially around specific legal holds where you, again, want to take that bulk action. And also being able to remediate data, and these are the actions that are very common that folks need to take. And I just also wanted to touch really on the challenges that we face day to day. This is why it's not an easy job in terms of the type of data that we're dealing with. It's not always clearly structured data. There's a lot of unstructured data that contains personal information that needs to be addressed, right? A lot of that is where the risk occurs. Thinking about when you think about Internet of Things or like data in motion, data pipelines, certainly you want to be able to take action right away. One of a great example is a large institutional bank that's a customer of ours. certainly about 2 years ago, their challenge was starting to migrate to the cloud. And their concern was that as they slowly migrated their different data domains, they were concerned that they could inadvertently be sending personal information to the cloud. And they wanted that stopgap, that sort of guardrail that we're able to monitor and ensure that personal information, live production information of personal nature would be sent to the cloud. So without actually slowing down that type of initiative, they wanted to make sure that, again, putting that type of automation in place with a discovery solution. And then in terms of finding the data, so classification is a big challenge. I mean, organizations today, they can rely on, things like pattern matching. You can write fantastic SQL codes. I mean, sure, everyone has that skill. But really the challenge is, things, you look at something like a credit card number. It's a string of numbers, but it can easily be misinterpreted as an account number. But there's certainly things that can be done to validate and verify certain information. Something that we do at Big ID is certainly employing checksums to ensure that it's a valid credit card number. So it's more than just pattern matching. That's where you can get a lot of false positives. And it's more than just writing a regular expression, a standard format. There's other machine learning techniques that can be applied to increase the accuracy of the data. And it's certainly something that should be explored. Again, you don't want to have a human eye reviewing every single document and then determining the action that should be taken there. I mentioned earlier the sort of the different contextual differences and making sure that you're not deleting something that inadvertently could be used by another line of business or for another purpose completely within your organization. So I know time is almost up, so let me just quickly go through. So just thinking about the different day-to-day responsibilities of data management, certainly when it comes to privacy, security, and traditional data lifecycle management, it has an impact on ESG priorities. So again, I love the privacy regulations that really make it really clear on stating, creating the data and then also storing the data is based on the purpose of use, and certainly the risk aspects of and cybersecurity risk breaches. It's, really being able to make sure you're not keeping more data that's necessary because it poses significant security risk. And then just doing good data management practices, right? In terms of deletion, if you don't need the data anymore, it's exceeded its limit, certainly being able to delete it. So just in summary, I think these are, just really key points that I've mentioned so far in terms of what companies, organizations should be doing when thinking about data retention. There is a clear alignment to data storage in terms of the hidden costs, but also the environmental costs. I think that should be talked about more in these type of forums. And again, the type of regulations, the privacy regulations, encourages the proper storage and collection of data, and that's really key. And then from an analytical perspective, more data is not always better. It's the right data that really matters. And then it all starts, again, with really knowing what your data is and having these type of automation and data discovery to help solve that problem. That's really the first key that I talk to a lot with my customers. So with that said, I do want to mention that this presentation was created by generative AI, meaning I did use a software tool called beautiful.ai. For those of you who have not heard of it, I highly recommend it for helping to create really pretty, simple slides. And what they do is actually, I typed in a lot of the text, and the generative AI part is telling the tool, I want this to sound a little bit more professional. I want this to sound funny. So I changed some of the bullet points just so that it would fit with the tone. So from that respect, I recommend Beautiful.ai. And again, I don't work for them, but I think it's a great example of the different generative AI tools that are out there can help speakers. So.
Okay, Peggy, thank you so much for the talk and explanation of solutions which can be put into place here. Any questions for Peggy? Question over there.
Peggy, thank you. Not really a question, just a comment about step 2 and 3 when you were talking about retention. And step 2 is mostly focused on, like you said, compliance, legal, practice.
Contextualization, yeah.
Contextualization, right? Part of the contextualization is also policy and direction, organizational direction. So for example, in the healthcare space, there's a ton of data that we have. And most organizations have retention policies somewhere around the 7 to 10 year mark.
Mm-hmm.
If we start deleting data that is 10 years old, next year we will lose anything that we had prior to the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Which means for researchers and other large health policy purposes, we will lose that historical knowledge beyond just aggregated reports that are already published about what was the difference that a certain policy at a national level, a set of policies they made, and what did it take to bring that into existence. So I think there's another aspect to it, which is not really focused on the compliance piece necessarily, but also looking forward to saying, what's the other value that it could provide?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And again, never worked in the healthcare industry myself, but again, I don't think the retention policy, again, should be reviewed within the healthcare industry. And I don't think it should be a clear-cut absolute in terms of complete deletion. And certainly, if there's some relevancy for research purposes, certainly that's where accommodations can be made. So it makes sense.
Any other questions? A couple of questions.
Yeah, so I'm going to add a little bit to his in form of maybe a quasi answer. So I agree with you on the healthcare EHR data, but the healthcare industry is so much bigger than just the EHR data, and it's something that I think the practices that Peggy is talking about really do come into play when you start to think about like your ERP systems and all the other things that make a company work and be fueled. So I love everything that you said. I do think the challenge for some industries like healthcare is getting folks to start to think about what you're saying in a way that they can start to implement some of that. I think the other thing that's interesting, and this is really a question because it's something I struggle with, is as we start to onboard more big platforms that have their own embedded data and analytics capabilities within them, a lot of times it almost forces us to duplicate our data and fit it into whatever mold goes into those platforms in order to enable the capabilities that create the embedded analytics. Are there ways that you've seen that help you to either avoid those kind of situations, or are these just inevitabilities that we'll just have to start moving our data to a lot of different places in order to get the best bang for our buck from all the different products that we implement?
So even though I work for a technology software company, I think this is unfortunately where technology drives the best practice solutions. I mean, if you think about it if you eliminated technology solutions and rigid frameworks, you would not be duplicating all that data. You would not be forcing yourself to adhere to those bad habits, I would say. I don't think there's a right solution other than building your own bespoke, which is not really possible. But this is where, again, data governance needs to really come in play, and really understanding, acknowledging that there are the duplications, and doing the, monitoring the data quality and consistency of it, and thinking about, I would say, just a better data architecture, whether or not those technology solutions are those solutions a must for your organization in terms of the purpose it provides, and unfortunately having to live with those type of, and just because of the technology decisions you live with. So, Christine?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, and just perhaps also comment, we have been working with European companies on their data practices for ESG reporting, and I very much agree with you that the data lifecycle obviously has a huge role to play in that. But what we actually came up with is there's a lot of new data that actually we have never been captured, because it's about emissions, it's about certain recycled material, for instance, in shoes. If you look at fashion industry, a lot of the information that could possibly be there about the type of materials being used, it has never been systematically captured, or not captured in a good quality. Mm-hmm. And this actually calls for thinking about sourcing of data from external parties. It's also about basically adhering to completely new classifications. So I think I very much like, obviously, to see the to emphasize on what we already have been preaching for a long time, but I also see that there is a lot of pressure on actually rethinking also the practices and going a little bit beyond what we have been doing. And in that regard, perhaps so I would like to see a little bit like your view on, and also the experiences that you have. So what is actually new about ESG, and not the old things that we already know?
No, I mean, again, I think these are very interesting topics that quite not discussed in these type of forums, and I think this is where people, folks, have different perspectives. I think this is certainly a great topic for more best practices to come about. So.
Just to add to that, because my background is ESG, and a lot of work, and actually helped put the track together. There's a lot of external data, which helps classify. The biggest one is EcoVent. I don't know if you've heard of EcoVent. It's a huge database of basically taking a product, a material, you put it into EcoVent, and EcoVent then gives you the sustainable view of that data. Okay, it's been going for about 30 years or something. It's got big, but it's inaccurate. It's because it's evolving, and continuous change is occurring. So there are external data sources, and EcoVent is the main one, to answer your question on that. But bringing that data set, discovering that data set, matching it with the company's data set to look at existing materials, projects and construction projects, and then looking at alternative construction, alternatives for that from a carbon and an ESG perspective, we're at the very early stages of looking at that. And tools like Big ID and the work which Peggy's proposing here from a discovery point of view can actually help that matching exercise. So I think it's a very powerful capability Big ID brings to the table for ESG, in my perspective. Anyway. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Peggy and Big ID.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's time.
Everybody have a great evening. Take care.